coming and attending. It's not on. Try it again. Now? Over to your phone. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for coming. Thank you to the Mayor's Office for his remarks and his partnership in this conference. And thank you to the distinguished Dean for his opening comments, and to Kazakh National University for hosting this important conversation, a conversation that has taken place in many regions around the world, the relationship between religion and security and citizenship. I am grateful for the opportunity to be surrounded by such wisdom and to learn from each of you. And my goal today is to try to provide some context for how we think about these issues. My organization works on issues of freedom of conscience or belief, religious freedom, and relating them to issues of security and stability, taking a holistic approach to how these things are lived out in complex contexts in countries in transition. And our basic premise is this: if religion has been a part of the problem, then religion has to be a part of the solution. To put it another way, only the best of faith defeats the worst of religion. And I want to talk a little bit about that. My presentation is based on our global experiences in places like Tibet, in Xinjiang, where we work with the Chinese government, in places like Vietnam and Laos, in Myanmar, in Pakistan. We have a delegation from Peshawar University. This is a picture of my beloved Peshawar here on the front. And we have also worked in the Middle East, North Africa, in Tunisia, in Syria. So my perspective is informed by those experiences from around the world. The bottom line that I would like, the case that I would like to make to you, is that we can protect our interests, our hard power interests, when we live out our soft power values. That they are two sides of the same coin. And if I were to speak to you in American security English, religious freedom equals the capacity to counter violent extremism. Religious freedom equals the capacity to counter violent extremism. So my presentation then is going to place this discussion of religion, security, and citizenship in historic and geographic scope, but then I'm also going to try to raise some issues for our three themes that have been identified in our previous meeting in Astana, of the relationship between religion and identity, religion and gender, and religion and education. And then I will wrap up, as any good academic does, with some graphs that try to summarize all these in one piece of paper. Some of my slides will have many words. I've done that on purpose because I want you to focus on listening to what I'm trying to say. I can give you the slides, and you will have all the words there for your further education. If you want the slides, I can make them available. So that is what I'm going to try to do. We can go to the next slide. I first began to learn some of these lessons about religion, security, and citizenship from a man by the name of Halford John Mackinder. He is an Englishman, and he is the man who first taught me to see history through the eyes of the East, as a Westerner, as an American. He is the father of geopolitics. He is the intellectual godfather of the U.S. policy of containment of the Soviet Union. I'm not going to explain all that today, but this is a very important figure intellectually in the evolution of the thought of geopolitics and American global security strategy. Next month marks the 110th anniversary of his first presentation of a philosophy that would guide his thinking and writing throughout his entire life. He made a presentation on January 25th, 1904, to the Royal Geographic Society, and he presented a concept called the heart map. And there he put forth some very bold ideas. This quote, summarized, says that he said that the Europeans and the English, The English had the greatest empire the world had seen to date. And he challenged them to think about European history as subordinate, as below Asian history. Because the Europeans had been forced to develop their centralized states in response to the Mongols coming east and the riding horses and defeating the Europeans in battle. And that with the rise of the railroads, the world would be connected. That there would be a closed political system. And then one action in one part of the system in the world would reverberate and echo and affect other parts of the world. Mackinder talked about globalization a century before we talked about it. And he did so in a very thoughtful way based on his concept of the heartland. Here's a picture of the heartland. He had three interpretations of it. One was in 1904, the speech before the World Geographic Society, and he defined it in the context of the competition between the great game between Russia and the United Kingdom. The second interpretation was in 1919, and he expanded the borders of the heartland to include Eastern Europe, because he believed that the contest between the German and the Slav was the key to understanding who would exercise influence in the heartland. And he called for a border area of buffer states anchored in Poland to balance Germany and Russia. Because whoever won that contest would control all of the heartland and therefore control the world. And in 1943, while World War II still raged, he wrote his final article at the age of 83. And he made the following proposition. He said and predicted that America, Europe, and Russia, which included Central Asia to his mind, they would be united together, pledged together in peace to balance China and India. Not against China and India, but to balance China and India. Those were his predictions. And what I want you to take away from this, whether you agree with it or not, is that the heartland, the pivot of history, he called it, was always Central Asia. Central Asia was the key, because he believed that whoever had influence here or controlled here would be able to exercise influence back and forth. And so for him, the heartland was the center of the world. And you had to understand history and geography through the center of the world. Now, you can have different opinions about what this is and what this means, and I'd be happy to talk to you about it because I wrote my dissertation on it. Applying thinking of Halford and Mackinder to the relationship between the U.S. and Uzbekistan. But these things are still quite real. As a case in point, when the Russian armies, the Soviet armies came west in 1944, they stopped outside of Warsaw. And they watched the skyline disappear as the Germans and the Poles fought each other. Totally destroyed. Later, Stalin would take all of Eastern Europe as a buffer zone against the Germans, implicitly endorsing this theory of the heartland. And to rebuild the skyline of Warsaw, he would give the Palace of Culture, which the Poles did not receive very well. I used to live in Krakow. I know a little bit about Polish history in 1988, 1989. Last night, the Palace of Culture was illuminated in the colors of yellow and blue to show solidarity with Ukraine. As the ideas go back and forth, who is going to control the heartland? Who's going to control the buffer zone? Which ideas are going to win? How are we going to think about the scope of history and geography and how things are united? These things are still relevant. Still relevant to our world today. But the bottom line for us, next slide, is Central Asia is important. Now, Mackinder is an interesting example for us as intellectual thinking and creative and critical thinking. He was an Englishman whose empire was based on sea power, but yet he focused on Central Asia and land power. He thought outside of his mind and outside of the context in which he had been born, which is very hard to do, especially in the Europe of that day. It was an imperialist, Darwinian Europe. And he dared to say that there's a different way of thinking about how we should consider the balance of the world and how we should think about interests and values. And instead of putting himself at the center of the geopolitical universe from the top down as the United Kingdom, he insisted that the, quote, periphery, the margins, was actually the center, the bottom up. The bottom up was what was important. The area of Central Asia, the pivot of history, was what was most important. And then he also insisted that this theory be adapted to each and every age when a new strategic era was ushered in, such as after the end of the Cold War. So he's an important model for how we think intellectually. But what's most important for us as we think about the issues of religion, security, and citizenship is how did he plan to do that? What was his plan for achieving this sort of geopolitical awareness where interest in hard power was balanced with values and soft power? In a sentence or two, he believed that the capital of a country, the top down of a country, had to be economically integrated with the provinces, with the bottom up. And that integration depended upon an education not just for the elites, but for the working class. This is really quite radical in that time period. He was writing this in 1919. And to prove it, he went to Oxford University. He would later co-found the London School of Economics and do a lot of, quote, elite things. But he established an extension campus for working class people in Reading, which became Reading University, and spent 10 years as the vice chancellor of that, making education available to the bottom up, to the working class people, for the sake of the nation to be educated to think bottom up and top down together. Because he understood that geostrategic interests, the things that we are defined against, the things that we must protect against, terrorism in our day, can only be undergirded by the things that we are for, the geosocial values, from the bottom up, from the people. In today's world, what we're talking about is the balance between hard and soft power, and we're talking about their combination in the application of hard and soft power, which sometimes is called smart power. And this is how the U.S. is trying to think about these things. I do not speak for the U.S., but I was in the military for 9 years. I worked at the Pentagon. I'm an advisor to the State Department. These are the types of things that we are trying to think about in Washington. In fact, if you want a good example of it, there's an opinion piece in the USA Today written by two friends of mine, Admiral Stavridis, the former commander of NATO, and General Zinni, who used to command Central Command, which includes Central Asia. And they make the case today, in this opinion piece in USA Today, for smart power. Otherwise, if you don't have smart power, you're reduced to always reacting with hard power. And this is exactly what Mackinder was arguing for. So in his time, in 1919, another quote that you don't have to read, but he tried to make this case linking hard and soft power together with the minorities in his own context. And the Scots were looking for independence, the Irish were looking for independence, and they were protesting against England. He said, why do you think they're protesting? Do you think they're protesting against the wickedness of England, or because they want equal opportunity? They want to be at the same table, minority and majority together, with equal opportunity to learn and listen from each other as equal citizens under the rule of law. This is the case that he was making. Now, what does this mean in our current context? This is a picture I took when I was the guest of the Secretary of the Navy on July 4th, which is our Independence Day. And maybe you can see it, but this is the World Trade Center back there. This is July 4th, 2000. And this is a carrier. This is the ultimate symbol of American hard power. And there's some ironies to the attack from the terrorists that we received that day. Because we have common interests. We do not want to be attacked by terrorists. But here are some of the ironies. If this carrier had been in the harbor on September 11th, 2001, it could not have defended us. We cannot kill our way to victory. We were attacked from the bottom up. We were attacked by non-state actors. We were attacked by educated suicidals who believed that they were implementing their religion. And we had been taught that religion was dead. So what do you do with that? How do you defeat the enemy if you can't kill your way to victory, no matter how many drone strikes you have? Thanks. Here's a picture I took of a Central Asian shepherd. Another quote from a Kinder. What does the ordinary man want? And woman? A chance to have a life of dignity and to live out their ideas and values. What is going to shape this man's perspective? How is he going to think about the opportunities? The key to this picture are two things. One is his head, and the second is his shortwave radio. There's an American political scientist named Ted Robert Burr, and he said, "Why do men rebel?" And the short answer is a concept called relative deprivation. Men rebel because they are aware of what they do not have in comparison to others. In an age of globalization, we have enhanced relative deprivation. This person knows what he does not have all the time. This person stands the opportunity to be manipulated by religious extremists, to become a terrorist fighting with the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan on the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, to explain why he has no opportunity, why he has no dignity, to be manipulated by Hizbut Tahrir, etc. The key to victory is being inside his head. This is why education is so important, to prevent that from happening, from him being manipulated. So, as we think about our themes for our conference, we can go to the next one. I want to give you some ideas for your consideration. You can rebuke me, or agree with me, or talk about them as you like during the presentations and during the Q&A. But religion and identity, it seems to me, is the fundamental question that we are focused on. And there are two choices for the individual from the bottom up and for the institutions of government from the top down. The individuals have to choose whether they are going to tolerate or celebrate somebody who is different than themselves. This person does not vote or pray like I do, or act like I do, does not look like me. Do I tolerate them? Do I allow for their existence and don't engage them? Or do I celebrate the dignity of difference and find ways to work together across ethnic and religious divides? That's the individual choice. People of faith have to live out this choice. Every faith has a golden rule. That's what I mean when I say the best of faith defeats the worst of religion. If the faith tradition lives out the golden rule of treating your neighbor as you wish to be treated, then there's more opportunity for stability. Now, here's the choice of governance from the top down. Do our policies assimilate or integrate? Assimilate says minorities, ethnic or religious minority, have to look like the majority culture. Integrate says minorities will be celebrated for their dignity of difference and welcomed in according to, not despite, their ethnic or religious difference or diversity. We in America have learned this lesson the hard way. Our Constitution started out with African Americans being 3/5 of a person. We are passionate about this because we have sinned. And we were wrong, and we are still paying the consequence for that sin. The world needs countries and constitutions that celebrate and integrate the dignity of difference. Otherwise, there will be security implications. Our second theme, religion and gender. As the Dean noted, this is a very rare topic. But I can tell you, in all of the conversations that I'm having around the world, this is the topic that always comes up. And here's the other conclusion. Nobody knows how to talk about it. Nobody knows how to talk about it. So some ideas for thinking about this. In America, we have the three Ds of security: defense, development, and diplomacy. But in development, we all know that if a woman is educated to a 5th grade education level, that community will transform because she will in turn educate her children. How does that relate to security and stability? Do we have to reimagine development? In diplomacy, the United States just developed a new plan, a national action plan for women in peace and security, and do not mention women of faith at all. How is that possible? They're 50% of the population. But we ignored them completely. And in defense, in Central Asia, we have seen the rise of what we once thought was impossible: female suicide bombers. These are all real issues. We do not know how to talk about them. We need to know how to talk about them. This is brand new territory. And then the next one. And then yesterday we had a wonderful conversation here in this room, the Heart of Asia Experts Forum, about education. And we had 5 quick takeaways for Central Asia. The baseline for education, that is still a region where rote memorization is the norm. There was agreement about a vision toward the future that education should produce employment and empowerment and new ideas of citizenship. There was the understanding that religion is a part of the reality of this world that we live in Central Asia. That students come with spiritual yearning, not necessarily religious yearning, but spiritual yearning. And if you don't address that, there are opportunities for it to be manipulated by religious extremists. You have to address it as a function of security, not just as a function of education. How do you do that? There is a need for a safe space to continue the dialogue. Where do we have these conversations? This is the only place we know of in Central Asia where these conversations are happening about these themes. And then lastly, as a practical point forward, maybe what we need is workshops to educate and equip the educators. How they can think about and be prepared to address these complex issues in the classroom, because they are there and they are real. If you ignore them, you will make the situation worse. Okay, next one. So, in conclusion, I promised you a couple of graphs that would explain everything. I think this is the world that we live in a nutshell. On the right, we have these issues that are global challenges, and they have a couple of key characteristics. One is that none of them can be solved by a state actor from the top down or a non-state actor from the bottom up. Which is to say, it is not a question of if, but when you will partner with state and non-state actors, with people and organizations who do not have the same philosophy or theology as you do. You are going to have to work with somebody who is your total opposite to take on our common global challenges. Which is to say, as you operate at the center of this Venn diagram, you will exhibit a philosophy or a theology of the other in how you engage. When you have these partnerships with multilateral organizations and NGOs and governments, the way you treat them will demonstrate how you think about the other, the minority, those kinds of things. What is that? And then in the process of building the partnership in this Venn diagram to apply to these challenges, will you live out the values of the dignity of difference so that they will be embodied in your response to the challenge? That's the key before us. From the bottom up and the top down, government and grassroots, we have to work together in the middle of the Venn diagram to do this. And I happen to be a Christian, so I like to say love your neighbor, but let me explain it practically. Listen, observe, verify, engage. Not all partners are good partners. Some of them are bad, some of them will manipulate you. Okay, last time. Here's another way of thinking about it. If track 1 in conflict resolution speak is government to government, and track 2 is people to people, the track 1 of the government, governments have to be equipped to think about and provide policies of religious freedom. But at the same time, people from the bottom up, track 2, have to be equipped to exercise that freedom responsibly. Too much tolerance can lead to terrorism. We know that. But freedom exercised responsibly will prevent terrorism because people will be allowed to live out their faith and police their own ranks. And those worlds come together what we call a track 1.5 world. Between government and grassroots, track 1 and track 2. Track 1.5 is where civil society can ensure the stability of the state with equal citizens under the rule of law. So here's my conclusion. Back to my man, Alfred McKinder. The key to this whole thing is citizenship. How are we going to think about citizenship in our day and age? And there are 3 kinds. There's a spiritual citizenship if you happen to believe in something greater than yourself. You've got to come to grips with what that spiritual citizenship is and what that means for engaging the other, no matter how different they are from you. There's a global citizenship. We have challenges that we cannot solve by ourselves. Terrorism is one of them. We have to stand against terrorism. We have to protect our interests. But the only way to do that is to live our values. And then the last form of citizenship is the state identity we have in the countries where we live. Each country has its own path. But these values, I'm convinced from my experiences in regions around the world, are common to us all. So thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. I look forward to learning from each of you over the next 2 days. Just a little